think back to the day of the march, and as you were preparing to go to the mall, what were you feeling inside, and what were you expecting to happen? Did people have a good idea of what was actually going to happen?
No, we really didn't. And I was there because, as I told you earlier, it was my first job assignment for a new job I had taken with the YWCA of the USA as director of the Northwest region for the College and University Division. And frankly, we didn't know. I was just told, fly to Chicago, get on the Freedom train, and head for Washington, D.C. The one thing I was concerned about is that my wonderful father, sociologist father, he really didn't want me to go, although he had taught me as a child while living summers in North Carolina about the evils of racism and all that you needed to do to try and change systems. When it came to his daughter with 4 small children going off to a march and not knowing whether it would get violent, not really knowing what direction it might take. Frankly, I was excited. I was thrilled to have been asked to go, but I did not know what to expect.
So, as you arrived, what did you do? Kind of walk me through that day.
Okay, we got off the Freedom train, which had come from Chicago with, I think, thousands of us on it, including many students. And we were bused to a starting point of some kind. And there I joined hundreds of other YWCA leaders, black and white, who had come for the march. And there were so many people there, what we did was start marching and singing much of the time, "We Shall Overcome." And I happened to be fairly close to the beginning. So we just marched until we got to the memorial and then sat down on the grass and waited to see what was going to happen. And I'm not sure that I was even clear about who all the speakers were going to be. I knew of them. I certainly knew about the organization of it, partly because our racial justice director in the YWCA was Dorothy Height, very famous, very well known, very responsible for the emphasis in our organization on being activists and trying to make social change. So she had talked about the leaders that helped organize it.
Okay. Where were you based in this job that you had?
They let me work out of my home. It was a traveling
Which was
job.
Here?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
It had been based in Portland. It was a traveling job which put me on about 20 campuses in the Northwest where they had YWCAs. And part of what I did with my experience after the march was speak on those campuses and talk with students about racial justice and what kinds of activities and actions could they take.
Do you remember on that day of the march, what was the day like?
Hot and sweaty. It was very hot, and all the heat had gone out of the train. There was a failure of their electrical system, so it was terribly cold all night long on this train. And none of us came prepared with coats or anything because we knew Washington, D.C. would be hot. And so it was hot. There were a lot of people mopping their faces and fanning their faces, and eager, though, to get to a place where they could sit down and wait and find out what was going to happen next.
Were you at all fearful for violence?
No.
Were you prepped, and did anyone tell you that violence could
No,
occur
my
or
father had
anything
expressed his concern about what was I doing going off. I, too, am a sociologist, as he was, knowing something about crowd behaviors, going into this unknown kind of event. And after all, I had 4 small children aging from 2 years old to 7 years old, and what would happen if something happened to me. But frankly, I said, well, after all, Dad, you're the one who taught me to be concerned about these issues. And so, no, I really wasn't afraid. It was a mellow crowd. You know, they cared, they were singing. I didn't have any sense of fear at all.
What was it like riding on the Freedom train? What did people do in the train?
Well, it was a night train. We were on it all night. Many of us had flown into Chicago. People were trying to sleep, but then they got quite miserable on this particular train because it got so cold. And there wasn't a lot of chatter because we were up all night on the train and then knew that we had to be in good enough shape to march some distance when we got there. So there wasn't a lot of conversation. I was with students,
Okay.
but
You were with students?
they were trying to sleep with students
Why
and a couple,
students?
yes,
Okay.
and a couple of other staff members.
Okay. About how many students did you have along?
I don't know because they were sprinkled. Some happened to be in the immediate area where I was. Others were sprinkled throughout the train because there were so many people that came out of Chicago.
Were there WSU students?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, none that I know of,
Okay.
no. As far as I knew, I was the only one from Pullman, Washington, going to march on Washington.
Uh-huh. And so when you got dropped off at the station, did it seem like everybody was headed to the mall, or what?
Well, we were bused part of the way after we
Okay.
got off the train, as I remember. And then, we were dropped off from the bus in a large crowd, and somebody told us what to do next, and we started marching.
You ended up at the reflection pool.
Well, we were very close to the podium and where the speakers were.
Yeah.
We were right at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial. And I'm not quite sure how we ended up there. Maybe we were early in the march, or maybe it's the people I was with knew how to move their way through the crowd. So, no, we were not back in that big mass of people you see by the pool. We were ahead of the pool.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the feeling amongst the crowd as they waited for the speakers? And
Oh,
so
kind of nervous and uncomfortable and wondering when it would all begin, but I think very, very anticipatory, wondering, what are they going to say? How will this affect us? What will we do with it after we hear it? Excitement, a mixed range, yeah.
Was there a buzz in the air about Martin Luther King speaking? I mean, maybe this shows my ignorance a little bit, but I mean, did everyone know he was going to speak? And
yes, and I think he was the key person they knew about. And I think, that was part of the draw, that people wanted to hear him. They certainly didn't know some of the other speakers, and nobody knew at that time that John Lewis would become so famous later in life. But he was on the stage. I think and they wanted to hear Mahalia Jackson sing, but I don't remember anybody knowing too much about other speakers. It was definitely Dr. King that was the key person you waited for.
And there was also other musical performances.
I just remember her singing. I don't remember all the rest of them that clearly.
I think there was maybe Peter, Paul, and Mary.
I think I'd remember that.
That was,
No, I was mainly impressed with Mahalia Jackson.
okay.
Yeah.
Joan Baez.
And probably I was very busy talking with the students, talking with the people around me, and waiting for the main show to begin.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then what happened after Martin Luther King Jr. spoke?
Well, I can talk mainly to what happened to me.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I did here this morning, sidebar, Martin Luther King III spoke, and he said that Mahalia Jackson called out to Dr. King, who went off script, we're told, to talk about the dream part. And she hollered something to him, according to some sources, saying, talk about the dreams, Martin. And so that had not been in the original script we're hearing from historians when he moved into that section. But that was, it was unforgettable. It's rather hard to put words to it because it was a life-changing experience for many of us. It was emotional. It was just amazing. It's hard to find all the adjectives to describe the feelings that we had at the time. It seems to me there was great silence at the time he started in that segment of the speech, and then just, tremendous excitement after he finished. But for many of us, it was, I guess, as close as you might come to a major religious experience.
Uh-huh. You were involved with social justice issues during this time and before you went to the March on Washington, right?
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that many times you felt very alone in this type of work.
Well, my dad, as I said, my dad was a sociologist. I majored in sociology. I had a great understanding about the need to be a part of groups if you want to cause meaningful social change. That all alone you don't always cause that much change. you get with a group that has common goals and strategies and purposes. And certainly as a student at WSU in the YWCA, we were working on racial justice issues, but they were different from the ones of the 60s. We were working very hard to get the discriminatory membership clauses out of the Greek system. We were concerned even then about the investments in South Africa. So there was ongoing dedication to social justice issues, and most of my participation was through the YW.
Okay.
And at my father's feet. He was a progressive activist and involved in all kinds of social movements.
He's the one that got you involved and energized.
Well, from the time I was very little, he had to explain to me about the segregated South when we lived in North Carolina in the summers, and he would go back there and teach at Duke or Chapel Hill, and he was from North Carolina and writing a number of books about it. But you can't be a little kid walking along with Daddy and see those restrooms, white and colored, without asking Daddy, what's that about and what does that mean? And then came the explanations about the evils of racism, and at some point this had to change. Just when in history there might be movements that can cause it to change, because now I'm talking late 30s, early 40s when I was living there at times. And it was shocking to those of us from Pullman, Washington. We had never seen anything like this. We didn't understand it. And so, my father was always teaching us.
What was his name?
Dr. Fred Yoder, Y-O-D-E-R, and he founded the Department of Sociology here. He came in about 1921.
Wow.
Retired in 1954.
So you started talking a little bit about the climate here on campus, really some of the issues. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, it's a real treat to hear from somebody.
And what period?
Well, the 60s.
Well, I think
70s.
After the march, I felt just kind of helpless. I didn't feel hopeless, because I thought, here's the hope, that somehow we leave this experience and we make something happen that changes all of this. But what do you go do? And I had just taken this job where I would be out on quite a few campuses in the Northwest. And what do you say in those conversations with students that can help make a difference? How do you help them focus on the issues on their campus? Can they even identify racism? And certainly the difficulty for most whites is identifying institutional racism. How do they see the connection? And do they understand that the very dearth of students of color and faculty of color and so on might be indicative of institutional policies and practices that need to be changed? So we talked a lot about, they were fascinated to hear about the march, but I wanted to move past that to, what do you as students at Willamette or the University of Washington or wherever you are, what do you do about that? And so that climate was kind of, how do you figure out what to do? We weren't into the 60s yet, or it was the very early 60s, and not a lot had happened that pointed in any direction where we saw a big movement that eventually coalesced, of course, with the anti-war movement. And on this campus, it probably took a major incident to get people really concerned about something could happen on our campus too, and then movements were sweeping every campus in the nation, and students got active. That's when I started spending most of my time doing workshops and training sessions around issues of racism. But what made that possible was the incredible amount of training and education that I received in the YWCA. With Dorothy Height at the lead, she was determined to teach us all how to be effective workshop leaders and work with our populations and how do you cause change. I brought many people to campus that helped train me and taught students, so that we had a huge cadre of students who were able to do this work. Reginald Wilson was key in training me. I don't know if you know who he is. Bob Terry, who wrote the book for Whites Only. a little manual done by a couple of trainers that I knew through the YW who were students of Paulo Freire, the great liberation theologist in Brazil, who caused a great deal of social change doing community organizing with people, helping them find a generic theme around which to organize. And then he believed, he very much opposed what he called the empty vessel theory of learning. The student's the empty vessel, the professor pours in the fluid, that comes back out. He believed that there were better ways to teach and train people around issues that involved posing questions that they themselves answered and arrived at their own conclusions, helping them organize around some generic theme. And so that became the root of the kinds of training and workshops we were doing here. It was used in other places also, frankly, but we brought many speakers to campus that helped spur us on and inspire us, but most of our time went to learning and training ourselves so that we in turn could have workshops going through all phases of campus life. There was a point where we had all of the students in Psych 102 or whatever the course was coming to participate in a simulation called Star Power, which helps people learn through a simulation game. I don't like that phrase very much. Things about classism and racism. It was a learning device that was very, I think, very useful, better than giving a lecture. So all of these activities were going on in addition to joining in coalitions to cause change around issues like how do we get counselors of color on campus? How do we increase the enrollment? How do we deal with things as simple as getting your hair done if you're an African American woman? At one point we were bringing someone in from Seattle to help do this. So it was all kinds of cultural and political issues. But I think the big message that was clear to many of us who were going through this training with YWCA leaders, the role of whites in this whole struggle. We needed to be the allies. We weren't defining the agendas. We were there to support and assist and help bring about change that was defined by the groups themselves. So that led to a great deal of coalition building on campus. Eventually, of course, there was the strike against institutional racism in the 70s that shut down this university, and that was happening across the country.
Do you remember what year that was?
Yes, so I remember it clearly because I know the students who wrote the strike demands, and I know where they wrote them.
Okay, all right.
And yeah, it was.
Well, tell us about that day. I really never have
well,
heard anyone describe that
okay,
day.
well, it was a group of a coalition group, some of whom were the YWCA student leaders, and frankly, they were meeting at Janetta Cole's house that day, and they wrote this list of strike demands. And I don't know why I didn't have time to go to the meeting, but I remember them calling me one Sunday afternoon and saying, "Hey, we just wrote a list of demands." And those you can find in the Evergreen if you go back to the spring of 1970. And there's everything from the makeup of juries in legal cases tried in Whitman County. That kind of went back to some of the incidents that went to trial. I think we were demanding a vice president of minority affairs. I don't remember if all the counseling positions were in place, whether we were demanding some more of those positions. But the big one, which I was kind of surprised that they agreed to, a mandatory racial justice workshop in the fall, at the beginning of the fall semester, mandatory for all students, all staff, all faculty, all administrators. And then a planning committee, an interracial planning committee, spent the summer developing the print materials that were distributed then, and bringing in, deciding who the speakers would be and arranging to bring them in. So the gymnasium was filled with people attending that required workshop. And I think the hope was that that kind of thing could happen at the beginning of every school year. Well, it never happened again,
Yeah.
but it was pretty amazing at the time.
You know, in reading, I think one of those centennial books talks a little bit about those, or that workshop. Was Glenn Terrell really involved with this whole process? What was your perception of his leadership throughout this period? And if it's not something you're comfortable with, that's fine.
Well, you know,
Because I got the impression from reading that he was really providing a lot of leadership.
I guess I was on the other side of this whole issue, you know, involved in the marches and the sit-ins and the you know, demanding this and that and the other thing. I wasn't alone. There were hundreds of us. So that I don't know.
Was it really a grassroots effort, would you say, then, at this university?
Yeah, I think it was pretty grassroots, but it had some very key leaders. Janetta Cole was very key in this. Some other people, like I could name quite a few names, but the student leaders. Most of us believe very much in student leadership of the groups that they were involved in, and so when I look back on it, it was a constant meeting of the student leaders who were meeting in Koinonia House, is now renamed, right? What's the name?
The K House, I think.
K House is what we called it, and that's where all the meetings went on.
Yeah.
And then when the strike was going on, they were held in Bowler Gymnasium. And the strategies just kind of emerged spontaneously from the group, and they decide, well, what are we going to do the next day to make our case on these issues? And many strategies were developed right out in the open with thousands of students attending. So it was a bit of a mystery to me why some folks felt they were caught unaware about some of the happenings in the community related to the strike. But Terrell was, you know, all the college presidents were in a very difficult position, because if you wanted to march on the administration, you know, where did you go? You went to French Ad. And
Yeah.
But I can remember one time when he had a particularly difficult session. There was a march. It's when the Cambodia invasion happened in the Vietnam War, and that's when a lot of campuses rose up, and students were very angry, and so I don't remember who even started talking about a march, but there was a march, and then there was a big sit-in. It was a rather large civil disobedience event, and he was very careful then. I remember he flew in he'd been out of town, he flew in. There were no great confrontations. They just kind of let it play out until people got tired, you know. And that was a very wise way to handle it. But then there was a committee that met with him and tried to negotiate some things in what we called then the Regent's Room off the President's office. And so I think that was handled very wisely. But it was mainly the students who were leading a lot of this. I wasn't in those sessions where they were negotiating and talking with the president.
Can I ask another question? This question kind of take us back a little bit to 1963. You talked a little bit earlier about how your dad felt about going, and you being a young mother, a young woman. I'm imagining it's probably also part of it. And I guess with your women's studies background, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about, what was it like preparing to go to the march, or even just sort of being an activist at that time as a young mother, as a young woman and a young mother and a young professional?
Well, it was just part of life. Again, I have to keep coming back to the YWCA, that I'd been an activist since my student days at WSU around one issue or another. They probably weren't as fierce and difficult as later in the 60s, but that was what attracted me to that organization in the first place, that they were working on social issues, they were taking stands on issues that interested me. Part of what influenced me greatly at that time was participation in a summer project in Washington, D.C., where those of us in that program lived on the Howard University campus. And that was a rather unusual thing to bring a group of primarily white YW and YM students in for a summer in D.C., where we had seminars all the time, speakers. We talked about social issues. We talked about methods of causing change. And so my whole time with the student YWCA was one of activism. And I suppose that's partly why we got involved in writing the request for a women's center, working to get women's studies on campus, took about 15 years to get daycare on this campus. That was greatly opposed. There was a key administrator who thought it wasn't a legitimate function of the college to provide child care, even though every other state college had daycare on campus. So it was just kind of a part of life. My father was both a professor and a politician. So I had gone around with him as he ran for office and lost always. The year he retired, he ran for the Congress and lost, as he knew he would. But I had trailed along, politically with him, putting up posters, I did television shows for him during his campaign, and so I guess it was just part of life in my family and also in my college experience.
So when would you say your political career began? Were you like 4 or 5 years old? But,
as long as I can remember, we discussed politics and social issues, and I always took long walks with him. He would talk with me about issues that nobody else seemed to be knowing anything about. Racism and sexism weren't exactly discussed in kindergarten and first grade when I was. But he would talk about social issues. He talked a great deal about war and peace. He was in the Battle of the Argonne Forest in the First World War, where very few in his battalion even came back alive. So he was a great peace activist. He was an international activist. He had been sent by the Rockefeller Foundation to spend a year in Japan and China in the 30s, and he came back from there fearful that Japan was arming for war. And he was a great public speaker, much in demand. So, you always had to go along and listen to Daddy's speeches and hope, that it didn't take too long. He was a good speaker, but I could just remember all the time he was either, giving speeches somewhere or being active in a Grange movement or a labor movement, and I tagged along part of the time. So it's how our family lived. Well, he very much believed that sociologists had to be working people in groups. After all, what's sociology? It's the study of how people behave in groups and what they do. And he taught all the social movement courses in the social department, the propaganda movement, or public, I'm trying to remember the name of some of them. I took all of them from him. But anyway, he was both teaching all of these things, but then he believed you had to live it out.
Yeah.
You didn't just go to the classroom and talk about it. You were active in things, everything from Kiwanis to the Democratic Party, where he was known as Mr. Democrat of Whitman County for 30 years, and that he strongly believed that you had to get active in a political party of your choice, in a group to cause change. So all of that, sank in. Right. I guess I have to stop and think about it when you ask the question, because it was just how life was.
I see. So do you feel like you faced any particular, maybe, I guess, were there times that you didn't get as much support in your activism because you were a woman, or because you were, like, for example, going to the march? Had you been, a man, would your dad been more comfortable with you going?
Oh, no, he was just worried about, what would happen to my children if something happened to me. But basically, he totally supported me in everything I did.
Okay.
When they eliminated all funding to the YWCA and I lost my job there and fought against losing it for 2 years, I remember he said, Elaine, he said, it won't do any good to struggle against the power of the central administration. You will lose. And I said, well, Daddy, at least I'll go down fighting, because we tried for 2 years to keep them from eliminating the organization. Well, they took away the majority of the funding, so the organization was crippled and weakened. And I was taken out of my job and moved to another place. I don't particularly attribute that to racism, to sexism. It was an issue of we were turning out too many student activists who could identify institutional racism and then, had methods and strategies to try and cause change, and it made the institution uncomfortable. And there were other groups too, like the Women's Liberation Front, that was busy working on women's issues, and all of the student groups of color were working hard on their agendas. But I don't know that I felt inhibited. I don't know. Well, ostensibly they did the same thing to the YMCA, but it had a very different outcome for reasons that are complicated. It didn't eliminate them, and you still see them very strong in Pullman, because they had a great funding base because they put out the Fusser's Guide, if you remember what that was. So they had a huge financial project that kept them solvent. The YWCA was more into selling pecans and having rummage sales, which didn't pay for the staff they needed.
Okay, thank you for answering that. Another question, what was the reaction to the March on Washington in Pullman? Did people take much notice? Was it talked about much?
I don't remember them talking much about it, but by then I was on this traveling job, so that I was out of town much of the time, or home with my family. I wasn't on campus anymore. I was on, except when I visited this association and helped them with things. I was out across the Pacific Northwest. And also part of my job was to arrange for Northwest conferences.
Well, how about then in your travels, as you traveled around the Northwest, was there people talking about it? Were they excited?
Well, my job was to visit the YWCAs or the YMYWCAs. Some were joint. And yes, they were very interested in hearing about it and knowing what it was like, in talking about issues they saw on their own campuses. And those varied. You had everything from Linfield College in Oregon, a very conservative religious school at the time, to the University of Washington, where my mentor, whom I had known first at WSU, was the executive director of the YWCA there, and they were in a great kerfuffle because they brought in Gus Hall to speak. And all YWCAs had an open platform policy. But the powers that be in the Seattle community didn't all approve of bringing the leader of the Communist Party to campus to speak. So they were going through great turmoil on that issue. They were so involved in that, and they were the largest association. I don't remember them being terribly involved in racial justice work, but I'm sure they were doing something. And our regional conferences dealt with issues of racism and sexism, and that it was a time when things really had not evolved yet in terms of a movement on student campuses.
Right. Well, even outside of campus, I think sometimes there's a perception of the civil rights movement, really only impacting the South or maybe the Midwest, the East Coast, and maybe California, but there's a perception that it really didn't touch, the Northwest. So even like the March on Washington, and I just wanted to hear your comment on how did it actually reach even up here?
Well, this is part of, I don't want to get deeply into voter registration, but that's where I really had my aha moment, when I was down there helping to direct voter registration in North Carolina. And a SNCC worker came through one night, and we talked all night, and pretty soon he turned to me and he said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Pullman, Washington." "Well, what's that?" You had the train car and the town with the same name. And then came, well, I hate to admit this because it was so bad, but then he said, "Well, why are you here?" And I said, well, I think it's very important that we register voters and we teach them how to use the voting machines, and students have come from all over the nation to the South to do this. And he said, well, don't you have any racism where you live? And I said, well, no, not much, because we hardly have any, I would have used the word minority, we hardly have any minority people there. There's only one black family. And he said, well, you know, this, now mind you, Black Power was coming into effect then, and SNCC very much was following what Carmichael was doing. And his message to me was, Whitey, go home. That your job, his point was, we will set the agenda for what we do in the South and in urban areas. Your job as a white person is to go back to where you came from and deal with your white brothers and sisters on issues of racism. And so that then spun off all that I started doing in terms of working with students on white privilege, on how racism is embedded in institutions, and we're part of those institutions, and we have the power often to cause the change that's needed. So I think that became a critical message throughout the YWCA, at least, that white folks had to work with white folks. One of the things Janetta said once, when Janetta Cole, when she gave a speech, she was trying to make that point, saying that, you know, with 47 black folks in this town and maybe 10,000 students, if each one of us had to take on X number of white people and educate them about racism, we don't have time. You know, you white folks have to do some of this yourself. So a lot of the workshops we did were what we then would call white on white, certainly with consultation with people of color, but really getting at the issues of white privilege and white power, the fact that we control most institutions, and therefore we had a responsibility to change them.
Was that hard to take, or was that shocking?
It made total sense to me.
In total sense.
But it was kind of, I don't think, oh yeah, I thought he's exactly right. The fact that we have so few students of color and faculty of color says something about the way this institution functions, and that can be changed. And probably the person that taught me the most was a trainer who published a little book, I actually brought it along, called White on White. And it was a whole training and workshop program for white leaders dealing with predominantly white groups. And and she's the one who also had studied under Paulo Freire in Geneva, Switzerland, and later went on to South Africa to work there. But she was a white woman who was very influential in helping me understand that whole concept. Because I think I saw racism primarily in an individual way. You know, it was discrimination. Well, I wasn't discriminating against you, was I? No. But, you know, that was only a small part of what racism is about. And then, you know, we started using the old formula of P plus P equals R. Prejudice plus power equals racism. And that there was a distinct role for whites to play in getting to know themselves, their involvement in the culture and in the institutions and the interpersonal relations too. But I think the most difficult thing was for students to understand the levels in which racism is embedded in the culture, in everything from music to art to, you know, all kinds of cultural aspects. We had exercises where they looked at that, where they looked at their white privilege, where they compared that with what people of color might be going through in a given circumstance, but then digging deeply into policies, practices, and procedures of institutions and where they could see racism there.
Yeah, that can be a difficult, you know, conversation. I've actually taught our introduction to ethnic studies classes at WSU, and so, you know, we have new freshmen sometimes, or students who may be seniors, but this is the first time they've really been confronted with this kind of, you know, issues around institutional racism and, you know, privilege and those kind of things. And oftentimes it's a really difficult process to even like begin to have the conversation.
Oh yeah, well, and sometimes I used to open workshops by saying, I'm white and I'm racist, and let me tell you why. That got their attention. But you know, I believe that you know, I grew up very privileged as a white person in this community, and in most aspects of my life. Privileges I didn't earn, they were totally unearned. They came to me because of the color of my skin. And I think just understanding what people called racism usually just meant interpersonal relations. It didn't dig deeper into the areas of culture and institutions.
Do you think that's the key of getting people to sort of think it's not necessarily racism makes you a bad person, but kind of thinking about how you fit into this?
Well, I think you go through a lot of things. We got to the point where on many workshops, unless we had 15 hours with a group, we weren't sure we could accomplish much. But I believe in a variety of everything from mini lectures to simulations. Bafa Bafa is one we used a lot. You know that.
Yep.
That one. You knew Ruben Duran? Did
Yes,
you know Ruben?
I remember him.
I remember when he was in one of our workshops, Rita was his spouse. She was the first Chicana on the national board of the YWCA.
Oh.
But Rita was very active with the YW, but he came once to one of our Bafa Bafa sessions, and he was really distressed and disturbed because it went back to all of the times when, you know, he was discriminated against because he couldn't speak English very well.
Oh.
It really, I was so sad because we'd hurt him so badly in that simulation. But I don't know if anybody, where did you hear about it, Steve?
Oh, well, we used to use it on
Did you used to
campus
use that?
do some
Okay.
training. Sure, as part of Alive at one point we were doing
Okay.
it, and yeah.
And it's a hard one to train the trainers because
It
you got
is.
to learn that
It
second
is.
language. You know,
Yeah.
it took a lot of time to get the students ready to do that.
Yeah.
When Star Power's all in English, it's easier. But I think there are a series of exercises, small group discussions. One that we found very effective to open workshops with was very simple, and it's out of this little booklet I'll show you before I leave. It just said, to me being a white person means, and then you finish that. To me being a person of color means, and you finish that sentence. No matter who you are, you finish that, and then in small groups of 6 you talk about what you just put down. And it's interesting to how something that simple could get at so much understanding in the beginning of these conversations.
Just kind of finish it with, since we've been talking about the march, you went in really not knowing what to expect, but you said that you became a changed person after experiencing that. In what ways? How did it change you?
I think I finally saw that while throughout my life I'd been interested in social change and dealing with injustice, I think I finally decided I could do something about it. That this inspired me. There were thousands of people there that cared too, that were willing to work on this. I could go back and maybe translate some of this experience to meaningful programs on student campuses. The dilemma was just, what do you do? But that became clearer and clearer, partly because of all the training and education that Dorothy Height and her team, you know, made available to us. They didn't leave us out there sputtering around, not knowing how to do anything. And there were constant training sessions for staff members and bringing us into headquarters in New York City to train us and teach us, and Dorothy herself spending a lot of time with all of us. So I don't know that I would have gotten too far on what to do next or how to do it without that kind of help from our professional staff.
Good. Mark, did you have any final
I think that's
questions?
a good way to close it.
So I want to put dates to you've done many things, but you mentioned, well, what was the span of years that you did the Y?
Well, I was a student here in the YWCA between 51 and 54.
Uh-huh.
And as many of my friends say, she majored in YWCA. Really. Then I worked as associate director of the YWCA here from 54 to 55. Then 60 to 61, I was suddenly hired to be executive director. Someone who'd been hired didn't show up. 63 to 66, I was director of the Pacific Northwest region for the YW.
That was when?
63 to 66.
Okay.
And then from 66 until they removed all of our funding, which I think we fought them on that until 1972. Then I was no longer I had been executive director of the WSU YWCA.
Okay.
So that all ended in 72.
Okay.
And then I moved on to great and higher things like director of supporting, what was that title they gave me? It was all the functions of the Dean of Students' office. All the counselors of color, the Women's Center, Women's Office of Programs for Women, the Daycare Center, Disabled Student Services,
Wow,
Crisis
good. Wow.
Intervention, the Conduct of Discipline Committee. But I really wanted to get back to a major focus on racial justice. So I resigned in 87. I guess from 72 to 87 I was some kind of administrator. The title changed at times.
Yeah.
But then in 1987 I took a job as director of the National Student YWCA, which put me traveling to student associations all over the country, much of my time spent in racial justice training and organizing conferences. And I had key people that were helping me, like my dear friend Janetta Cole, who had just become president of Spelman. So I quickly went there, and she opened her campus to a major regional conference that we did there on racism. And so sometimes it was conferences, more often it was just going on campus and having the YWCA I was consulting with ask me to do some racism work.
Great. Well, thank you, Elaine.
You're more than welcome.
That was really, really good.
Mm-hmm.